few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. Tucked away in the California countryside lies a farm. It's not a real farm. It doesn't exist outside of English class, but merely two friends' fantasy. Tell me about the rabbits, George. Whether it's a fictional tale of farmers or a true enough account of a trip around the country, that little word, California, works its way into the first few pages of nearly every story John Steinbeck wrote. East of Eden, the Salinas Valley is in northern California. Wayward bus, 42 miles below San Isidro, on a great north-south highway in California, to a God unknown. Nuestra Senora, the long valley of Our Lady in central California, was green and gold and yellow and blue when Joseph came into it. And on and on and on, descriptions of that sacred land, California. Two things make a Steinbeck story a classic Steinbeck: the countryside setting and his unassuming characters. Steinbeck wrote what he remembered and who he once knew. He was a master at finding beauty in the humblest of places and people, of the morally gray character you can't help but slowly find yourself in as you turn page after page. When Adam Trask aches, or Danny laughs, or Doc is let down, you feel the blows. And while the author dreamt up some of the most endearing figures of American literature, Steinbeck's greatest isn't a man. No, his greatest character is California itself, particularly his seaside slice of heaven around Monterey. It's not just geography, but truly a character in its own right. The mountains, the valleys, the coast, the beauty, the wickedness, the soul. Without California playing its role, his books wouldn't be great. I'm a student, but not a scholar. I'm not using his life and biography to chart every instance of the author finding himself at the tip of his blackwing. This is a love letter, a feeling, and if I may quote the man, it is a poem, a quality of light, a tone, a habit, a nostalgia, a dream. Harsher than Call, nobler than Lee, madder than Joseph, purer than Lenny, yet colder than George. Steinbeck's California is a stern father, punishing and unrelenting, building character while breeding resentment. It is a siren, beckoning families across the country with its sweet song and false promises. It is a foreign land, yet it is home. His memories of mischievous youth and the toil of manhood, the taste of sweet wine and fruit jars and lying drunk and happy and full of belly in the sun, the death of a generation of hard men, the birth of a new, harder one. Sweat on the brow, wiped off with a rag. His books aren't complete without it. But most of all, Steinbeck's California is him. Toward the end of his novel, Breakfast of Champions, Kurt Vonnegut inserts a version of himself into the narrative, not to take away the pain of his characters, but because the only way for it to end was for him to be a part of the ending. Steinbeck reveals himself in his stories too. When I read his books, I catch a glimpse of the author, crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, bifocals inching down his nose, a cigarette smoldering in the ashtray next to him as he writes. Feels like I'm sitting on the stoop of an old house, listening to my grandfather again, while he tells a story, just to me. And I think you'd like it that way. I think you'd prefer it. It's much more pleasant to hear the man's tall tales firsthand than to read reports on the man. As C.S. Lewis wrote, when the author walks onto the stage, the play is over. Steinbeck never walks on stage, but he peeks out behind the curtain, just to make sure you're enjoying the show. And then there's Travels with Charlie. I think that's why it came at the end of his career. Until that point, he used characters to shape California, but much like George and Lenny's farm, that California doesn't really exist. As a young man, he moved to New York, packing his memories with him, and as he ripened, he turned them into masterpieces. But he never told a story truly about him. At last he found the courage to write a story just about himself. Not a ship's log, nor a report on bomber squadrons and the villages they bomb and the men from the villages fighting a foolish war in a faraway land. Not a book about a sun-tanned farmer in the barren country. He left the pages behind to see his homeland again, as a homesick visitor, to see what had changed, what hadn't, and what was true, telling the tale of a man and his dog. Many a trip continues long after movement and time and space have ceased. I remember a man in Salinas who in his middle years traveled to Honolulu and back, and that journey continued for the rest of his life. We could watch him in his rocking chair on his front porch, his eyes squinted, half closed, endlessly traveling to Honolulu. Tired, at the journey's end, Steinbeck returns to the house and the boat and the woman he loves, back to his desk, his chair, his mug full of black-winged pencils, sharpened, a pad of paper in front of him. Steinbeck's greatest character isn't George or Lenny or Tom Joad, Kino or Danny and his paisanos, or any of the folks on Cannery Row. No. His greatest character is his California. His greatest character is himself. I remember an author from the Salinas Valley in Northern California who in his later years traveled around the country, and that journey continued for the rest of his life. We could watch him in his rocking chair on his front porch, his eyes squinted, half closed, endlessly traveling back to Monterey Bay, a loyal old dog laying by his side.